Okay, if there are no questions, I just thought that I may just talk very shortly about a recurring issue that shows up from time to time in application code. So a common mistake that you see that you can see in code. I've just seen it yesterday. So this was a question answered on Stack Overflow by Connor McDonald, who you may know, our developers advocate. If you don't follow him, do this. He has a lot of very good material on SQL and PLSQL in general, and it's always a pleasure to see his videos. So, and the question, so this was a question about a procedure that behaved correctly in one environment and behaved incorrectly in another environment. And the problem that is usually, the problem that was identified in this code by Connor, and I guess this was probably the actual problem, is I should probably say what I want to create. Okay, and then you see a query like right. So in this statement here, most people can probably quickly spot the problem because this is a very simple query on a very simple table. In real applications where you have complex column names, you have very complex conditions, you have maybe a few such comparisons in a single query, and you don't remember the data types of the columns by heart, it is easy to miss it. The problem that you see here is obviously that sysdate is of date data type, right? Which you can, for example, check this way. You see the type is 13, which is the type for date, right? The toDate function converts text to date. So what happens here is that toDate, when it is compiled by the SQL engine, the compiler, we call it type check, right? The type check functionality coerces the first argument to text. It expects the first argument to the function to be of character data type. If the first argument is not of the character data type, it will try to implicitly convert it to text. It will do exactly this, right? In most cases, there will be no problem, right? Even though, because what will happen? You will don't see a problem immediately. What happens is that because you haven't specified a format or any NLS parameters for toChar and toDate functions, the conversion will happen according to session parameters of the session, right? We have the date language, which is American in my session currently, and we see the date format, which is not American, not standard one. I have it probably set in the in the SQL developer preferences. So with this format, what happens is we just have an unnecessary conversion. It's not that bad, right? So the system date will be converted to text in this format, year, month, date, or whatever is the format that you have set for the session, that you may be aware of or not, because this is set from, in case of SQL developer, it comes from preferences. If preferences are not set, it comes from the territory, which comes from the Java locale, which comes from the operating system. So you may not really quite be aware of what the format is. However, the conversion to text happens according to this format, and the conversion to date happens exactly with the same format. So you don't notice any issue. So now, this is fine if the format looks like this, right? The problem may show up when, for example, your format, for whatever reasons, is a bit shorter. Right? What will happen now is that, let's say, let's insert into this table okay. Now let's see what is in this table, right? However, to make sure that we see the whole value, I will use an explicit format that shows everything that the column contain. Dual from this. Okay. So here we have everything is fine, right? However, actually, okay, let me see if this format has actually worked correctly. Session parameters. Okay. Okay, sorry. So with this, with the current date settings that I have, I was not able to show you the issue, because I would have to change the date on my computer. So the problem is that if you have such short format, right, and the format is actually the RR format, right, and you are around the year 50, right, so 2050, right, then what may happen is that when the date that you want to insert is not from the same half of the century than you are currently in, right, and you lose the century digits from the date in this conversion, you may actually end up storing the wrong century. I haven't prepared the test case, unfortunately, so I cannot tell you. With this format, you lose the century in conversion. However, fortunately, the century that is added in the conversion back is the current century. So as long as you are in 2000, then it will be fine. However, again, if you are at the century change, right, you can actually lose the century, because if you do 99, right, then the wrong century may be added to what you actually wanted, right? So there is this one problem. The second problem is, if you let's use my old format. The second problem is, because this was actually the original question on Stack Overflow, if you use a different format, let's say this one, right? Then you actually get an error. Literal does not match format string in this case, but there may be different errors from the date conversion range, depending on what format mismatch you have, right? And if you develop in an environment that or run this in an environment where the default format is this, right, which will be usually or often the case, then everything will work fine, right? If I say ddmm YYY for the session format, right, then the query goes through, right, because the formats agree, right? But then if some client connects and has a different session settings, this won't work for them, because one conversion, in this case toChar, will use the fixed format. However, the conversion to date will use the format that is in the session parameters. Actually here, it's less problematic because you kind of see both things. But remember, we have actually started with this expression where the conversion to char is implicit, right? So you don't really see this, right? And then this works fine. However, if we change the default format, the session format, right? So the session connects with the different settings, then this will not work, right? And this is not obvious when you actually do the conversion. So when you do any date time operation, right, you need to be aware that there may be implicit conversion. So compiler will not detect this senseless conversion. It will just add an implicit conversion operator to it. However, this can actually cause issues in your application later, and also these issues with century mismatch if you lose the century or information, or the half of the century kind of information for this. Okay, let me see. I see some questions on the chat. How to find if one session was changed a parameter compared with default basis on init aura? There is no easy way to do this, because first thing is that init aura parameters are not, I mean, you can of course always ask, query them, right? You can query instance parameters. However, the problem with them is that the view will only show you those parameters that are kind of set explicitly, right? Those that are defaulted from language and territory in init aura won't show up here. So you would actually have to kind of ask the session to first set the settings and so on. So it's quite complex. So basically, you cannot check it. On the other hand, you should not have to do this, right? The general approach, I know it's optimistic and you have sometimes restrictions because of some off-the-shelf applications that have some restrictions in how parameters are set or interpreted and so on. However, generally, when you write an application, it must be independent from NLS settings, right? So it should accept whatever the user wants. And you should never have to answer this question, right? Whether session parameters are different from the init aura parameters. Basically, it can always happen, right? It's very difficult to maintain this. You can, if you need fixed session settings, you basically have to set them explicitly in your application, right? With newest drivers, I mean, with any drivers, generally they will try to use the operating system settings to send them to the database. So if if a user has any control over their client settings, they may be different. So why even checking this? Just make sure that the application is written in a way that is independent of the settings and work in whatever settings the user wants. The session settings are exactly for this, to let the user decide what is his or her preference for formats, right? And in any situation where you have like prescribed format, like you get I don't know, text files that you need to load, right? Then you will use corresponding explicit formats in the application that loads it. In case of SQL loader, you can specify this in the control file for the load. In application, you can set it with alter session to make sure that it corresponds to whatever is in the text file. Otherwise, it should be really independent. And okay, the follow-up is the goal is to be able to generate alter session to go back to default configuration, right? And this is the problem. Why would we want to do this? Okay, so the question is, one session can change one parameter one session, and if the connection is used to another process, like on the RCP, we have to have control to rein it. Okay, so this is like session sharing. With session sharing, you basically should have, I mean, I am not an expert in session sharing. I remember that in certain situations, the settings are actually remembered. So when you have failover, some failover situations, then the settings are actually replayed from client side storage. So this is covered. However, if you just have sharing, there are certainly sharing scenarios, if I remember correctly, that where you have to reinitialize it. I don't quite remember. I vaguely recall that there was some mechanism, at least in one of this, because we have. I remember we have a few solutions for session multiplexing and so on, client side, server side. As I said, I'm not an expert here, so I don't remember all the possible settings. So if there is no such mechanism out of the box, so there is no like callback function or something like this, then generally you should remember the parameters in the application part, so that this part of the application that is kind of associated with the user, right? So if this is at 3 tier, then okay, so I'm just reading the questions from the chat. Okay, I don't. So there is no functionality to reset session parameters to like init or default, right? I have never seen anything like this, and I don't think anything like this actually exists, right? So the idea here is for any session to actually have application as level defaults, right? So this is actually how it normally works, right? So the normal approach is that you take the user preferences, which are in simplest way inherited from the operating system session, right? So if you have a 2-tier application, then this is simply the operating system configuration. In case of OCI, this will be simply the NLS settings in environment or registry on Windows. In case of 2-tier application, 3-tier application, then you need to have some mechanism in the application layer to associate a given user and his session with his preferences, and then you need usually some storage where you store these preferences, right? So like you have, I don't know, username, credit cards and other things like this. You also store user preferences, and for users that don't yet have preferences because they are just logging in or actually registering for the application, that you will use the settings that come from the browser, right? And you have 3-tier. In middle tier, you may have some mapping code that maps those browser preferences to Oracle settings or Java settings that will then be inherited by JDBC and passed to the session. So generally, the source of the NLS configuration lies on the application side, and basically when you hand over a session for the application, a database session for the application in the middle tier, right, then you issue an alter session to set the session to whatever the given user expects, right? You don't rely on init Ora parameters, because init Ora parameters, there are only one set of init Ora parameters, right? The default that comes from there does not have to be the good one for whatever are the users, right? Of course, in certain applications, like you have an application that is good only for United States, then you may want to always have the English as default. But in case you have the same application and it is deployed in different countries, you may actually want different settings, even though the application is the application is runs on a server in one data center for the whole world, right? So as I said, try to initialize the session with some defaults coming from the application and not reset the session to NLS defaults. I don't know if this is a answer is satisfactory to you, but as I said, so there may be some mechanisms where there is some kind of, it won't be init Ora default probably. I have to dig in my email archive, because as I said, I remember seeing something like or something like a callback, or maybe reviewing some functional specification for this type of functionality coming to something, but I may have mixed it with the failover, because it's a similar problem. You have to restart the session. So I don't quite remember. I have to dig a bit to see if there is anything, any way to kind of set a default set of parameters for such connection pool. If you ask this question, you might like shortly ask this question on the AskTOM interface. I mean, not the AskTOM question, by a question, the question of my office hours in particular, so that it's like a reminder for me, and then I can also look into documentation and see if I find something additional, and I can talk about it next month.